Was Nebraska always just a Dana Holgerson away from being really good on offense? Man, Penn State has got these nail-biting wins down to a science. They always find a way in Happy Valley. Just how many more down years from the SEC is it going to take before the Big Ten really gets their due? Let's take a spin around this big nation.
From Pasadena to Piscataway, College Park to the Coliseum, Seattle to State College, Columbus to Camp Randall, the Zoo to the Rock, and everywhere in between. This is where Big Ten fans gather to talk America's premier national conference with your host, Big Ten Ted. All Big Ten, all year long. This is Big Nation.
Now it's getting good. Now we are able to sniff the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis. We are able to sniff the college football playoff right around the corner. SEC teams, hey, they can maybe sniff a win against a 500 team, but they can't taste it. But more on that in just a little bit. Before I get into my three main talking points for this edition of Big Nation, I want to make sure I throw out two shout-outs. First being to the orange and blue of the Illinois Fighting Illini. Man, Brett Bielema was put on this earth to do one thing and one thing only: coach Big Ten football. 2 8-win seasons in 3 years. Man, he knows how to coach a football team. He knows how to build a culture. He knows how to build a program. A win over Northwestern would give them their best season since 2007, since the turn of the millennium. Since good old Y2K, Illinois has two 10-win seasons in 2001 and 2007. Keep that thing rolling, certainly, for Brett Bielema and Illinois. They've done a fantastic job this season. Caleb Johnson is Iowa. Iowa is Caleb Johnson. He's the best running back in the country, not named Ashton Jeanty right now. He has carried, maybe single-handedly carried Iowa to a few more victories this season. He is just 6 yards short of the 1,500 mark. So unless Nebraska literally builds a brick wall on the Kinnick Stadium field, he is going to eclipse 1,500 yards this season. 21 times he has gotten into the end zone. And he's just such a great downhill runner. Once he gets that first seam, it is insanely difficult to bring him down. That is going to be a big-time challenge for that Nebraska defense. But he just keeps on putting up big-time numbers. He should be talked about a lot more nationally. So I'm not a guy that's going to sit up here and scream SEC bias. I'm not going to shake my fist. I'm not going to yell at the clouds. Does it exist? Yeah, it exists. But sometimes the louder you yell, the stronger that force certainly gets on the other side of things. But there's a question that I talked about in the cold open that I am now going to expound upon here. Just how many more down years is it going to take from the SEC for people nationally to start talking about the Big Ten in the same breath as the SEC when it comes to the top conference in college football? Because right now, when you ask somebody, who's the top conference in the country, everybody just automatically defaults to the Southeastern Conference. But folks, look at your calendar. This is not 2006. This is not 2008. This is not 2009. Those days are gone. Last year, when we looked at the college football playoff and Alabama getting in, future SEC member, Texas getting in, and both of those teams losing to a current Big Ten team in Michigan and a future Big Ten team in Washington, a lot of people turned around and said, well, it's a down year for the SEC. And I'm like, okay, all right, that makes sense. We took advantage of it. Big Ten has got to keep that rolling. But now you look at the landscape of college football this year, and what are some SEC fans, what are some SEC people saying? Hey, it's a down year for the SEC. Well, that makes two. That makes 2 years in a row. Does that make it a trend? I'd say 3 maybe makes it a trend, but it is certainly trending in the direction that the Big Ten has caught up considerably for the second consecutive year. The big dogs in college football are in the Big Ten. We talked about the results of the 4-team college football playoff from last year. When you look at it in this year, it's Oregon, it's Ohio State, and then there's a gap when it comes to who are going to be the true national championship contenders. Who are the teams to beat in the 12-team college football playoff? When you look at the top of the Big Ten compared to the top of the SEC, I think Oregon and Ohio State are stacked teams. They are complete teams. There are flaws with Georgia. There are flaws with Texas. Of course, there are really good to great to maybe even elite things about the Longhorns and the Bulldogs right now, but I think it's very clear that the top of college football currently resides certainly in the Big Ten Conference. Folks, the pendulum is shifting. I don't believe that the SEC is some gold standard of football. I think this past weekend certainly proved that as well. Now, I will say this about the SEC as compared to the Big Ten. When you look at those 4 playoff teams, and there are going to be 4 playoff teams in the Big Ten Conference right now, it takes, even though I gave Illinois their credit at the beginning of this show, after that it does take a pretty decent drop-off for the Big Ten. But I think in that 5, 6, 7, 8 type of range for the SEC, I think that's where they have a little bit of meat on the bone. I think that's where they have a little bit of depth, certainly. But I will say this about those teams that sit in that range of the SEC. Those are the teams that gave Indiana an early Christmas present, a guaranteed college football playoff spot. Let's talk about these teams for just a minute, because the SEC, you know how they're going to spin it. They're going to spin it as, we got a really deep league, man. It is tough. Like Kirby Smart says, week in and week out, it's tough to play in the SEC. Let's take a look at some of these teams right now. Tennessee has a loss to a 6-5 Arkansas team. Ole Miss lost to a 6-5 Florida team. Florida's pretty good, though. I want to make sure I say that. Like they have a daunting schedule this year, right? In a schedule that's not as daunting, they're probably an 8 or a 9-win team. They got a bright future down there, certainly in Gainesville. Ole Miss also lost to a 4-7 Kentucky team. Alabama lost to a 6-5 Oklahoma team. Oklahoma's not good, folks. Don't let anybody tell you different. They are not good. Oklahoma did not score in the 4th quarter of that game against Alabama. Alabama played a bad football game, plain and simple, period. Alabama, we know, also lost to Vanderbilt. That was 6-5. Texas A&M, they lost to 6-5 Arkansas. Arkansas got a couple of big wins. What happened the rest of the season? Razorbacks. And then they lost to Auburn, who's 5-6. Auburn might be good in the future. They're recruiting really well. But folks, right now, Auburn is not a good football team. Don't let them convince you that Kentucky and Auburn and Vanderbilt and and Oklahoma are good football teams, because they aren't. Now, you look at all of those losses, and these are the teams that have certainly helped out Indiana by losing their 3rd game of the season. Everybody talks about and trashes Indiana's schedule, but you know what Indiana has done that these teams, even this past weekend, failed to do? They've beaten those teams. They've beaten the 6-5 type of football teams. They've beaten Nebraska. They've beaten Washington. They've beaten Michigan. All of those teams sit with a 6-5 record. I understand. Not every 6-5 team is created equal. Not every 5-6 team is created equal. I get it. I understand that, and I agree with it. But here's what I will say. When you get to those types of teams, when you get to that type of level, when you get to those teams in the Big Ten, when you get to those teams in the SEC, I don't think there's all that much of a difference. Indiana put a whooping on a lot of those teams. Indiana beat one of those teams with a backup quarterback by 2 scores. These teams in the SEC are losing to that caliber of competition. Now, we can talk about all of these points, and I can throw out whatever point that I want to throw out, but in the end, for the Big Ten to continue to chip away at that national narrative, you got to continue winning some of these postseason games against SEC teams. I talked about that before the semifinals last year, and look what happened. Michigan and Washington both got to the national championship game. I feel very confident about Ohio State. I feel very confident about Oregon, right? That one of those two teams can win the national title, can make certainly a significant run at the very least in the 12-team college football playoff. But I think it's going to come down to Penn State, and it's going to come down to Indiana. What type of showing do they have maybe against SEC competition in the CFP? What kind of a run can those teams type of make? That's, I think, really going to tell us where the depth of the Big Ten and really where this conference sits compared to that of their Southeastern brethren. All right, let's shift gears and let's talk about offense in Lincoln, Nebraska. And we're talking about it in a positive light. Who would have thought a couple of weeks ago that I would be saying that? But it turns out maybe Nebraska was just a Dana Holgerson away from being a really good offensive football team. What's the main thing that's really stuck out to me about Nebraska's turnaround here? Now, it's one game. I want to say that, but it was their best game. It was a really good game. And it was against the Wisconsin defense that did a really good job against Oregon the previous week. I think that this Nebraska offense is going more north and south and less east and west. When you were watching a Marcus Satterfield offense, specifically the last couple of weeks before they hired Dana Holgerson, what did you see? You saw a lot of screen passes. You saw way too many screen passes. This offense felt like it was in a box. It felt like it was constricted. It was not a confident unit. The play calling did not exude confidence in this unit, and the unit did not play confidently. But when I look at Nebraska against Wisconsin, I see an offense that's going north and south. I see Emmett Johnson is running north and south. I see them pushing the ball down the middle through the seam. They're pushing it on the perimeter as well, near the boundaries as well. They're using the talent that Dylan Raiola had. This is the best that he has looked, no question about it, all season long. If Nebraska can take this performance, put it in a bottle, and have a great performance against Iowa, this is going to be a team with a ton of momentum going towards the end of the season. The question for Nebraska now is going to be, can they do it 2 times in a row? Can they do it on the road at Kinnick Stadium against the Iowa Hawkeyes? If they do it there, and they're able to get the win and go to 7-5 and maybe win a bowl game and finish this thing off at 8-5, this is going to be one of the teams with the most momentum going into the 2025 season. I want to finish things off and talking about those cardiac cats, the Penn State Nittany Lions getting a 1-point win at Minnesota. This should surprise nobody that this was a close game. Preseason, all the way back in August when it was 80 and 90 degrees outside, I picked this game to be a one-possession game, right? Minnesota was coming off of a bye. Penn State late in the season. Things starting to tighten up a little bit. You maybe get the temperatures be a little bit cooler, right? It all made sense for this thing to be a tight game. Even this week, right? When I previewed this game earlier in the week, I predicted it to be a 24-16 ball game in favor of Penn State. So I predicted it to be a one-possession football game. But here's the thing about the Nittany Lions at Penn State. They're not going to be winning any beauty pageants. They're not going to be putting up a ton of style points because in order to do that, you need to have a lot of talent. You need to have explosiveness out there on the perimeter. Penn State just doesn't have it. But here's the thing. They always find a way. They find a way to win. Whether it's Aller getting Tyler Warren involved, or whether it's the run game, or whether it's the defense making key and significant plays. Whatever it is, this is a Penn State team that has been resilient all year long. This is a Penn State team that always just comes up big in key moments. Now, they're playing close games against a USC team that might finish 6-6. They're playing close games. They had to come from behind on the road against Wisconsin in the second half with a backup quarterback. You even looked at the beginning of the season in that game against Bowling Green in Happy Valley. But here's the thing. I know that will certainly not be the level of competition that the Nittany Lions will see in the college football playoff. But if Penn State is in that situation where they're down 4, they're down 6, they're down 7, and it's in the fourth quarter, whether it's that first-round home playoff game or whether it's at a neutral site at one of these bowl games in the quarterfinals, I'm going to have it in my gut feeling that says, hey, Penn State, I think they're just going to make a couple of plays because they've done it before. They've been in these situations mentally between the ears. They know how to handle these types of situations. I can't wait to see how Penn State finishes this season, right? Rattling off. That's what they needed to do. They needed to build that confidence, rattling off these victories going into the CFP. Penn State's performance in the college football playoff is absolutely fascinating to see. I can't wait to see exactly what they do in that particular situation. All right, folks, we are dialing it up to 1,000 here on the show. There is tons of content coming this week, so make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you're dialed in, because I am dialed in from now until January 20th and beyond. I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.
Thank you for watching and listening to Big Nation. Make sure to subscribe and follow Big Ten Ted on X, YouTube, and podcast platforms to stay in the know on all things Big Ten football.